All right. Hi guys, day 9, blocks 2. This is our last video of the geometry unit. So we have one last thing to discuss here, and then you're going to be doing a whole bunch of review. So the last thing we're going to talk about is our parallelogram. We've looked at a lot of parallel lines, so it makes sense to incorporate a parallelogram in this geometry section. You're going to do a little bit of exploration on your own. I just want to get you started here. So it says go to the following website, so you can either copy and paste or just type that in. You should see a picture that looks like this. I'll go to it in a second. You want to select parallelogram. You can turn off angles and sides, and then you're going to drag the vertices. So let me just go to the website and show you. So here's what the website will look like. And the point of using this is, since we're not actually at school to like measure stuff, we're going to measure segments. This will help you do it digitally. So make sure you click parallelogram, and then if you at the bottom here, if you click angles, sides, you can see the measurements. You can put the diagonals in. You don't really see any information about them, but it is nice to see them visually. So just as you drag the vertices around, you can move more than one. Drag them around. It'll always be a parallelogram, but just notice what's happening with the measurements, with the numbers. Okay, so take some time to play around with that. And then on the note sheet, I want you to see if you can fill out this first section, just the important properties. See if you can fill in the blanks here based on what you're noticing with the parallelogram on the website and specifically the measurements, and then we'll go over it together. All right, so here were my observations. If you didn't get 4 and 5, that's totally fine. Those are a little harder to see just from that manipulative, so no worries there. Just make sure you are changing your notes if you don't have these words. It's really important that you know these exact words. There's definitely other things you might have noticed that are true, but these are the ones that we really want to focus on. So make sure you're updating your notes as we go through them. So our properties of parallelograms. I'm going to label some on this parallelogram I drew. So if you want to draw in a parallelogram, opposite sides are congruent. So you should have noticed like the measurements, sides across from each other stayed the same. And they're parallel. So these guys are parallel and these guys are parallel. So that helps us work with the angles. Leads right into opposite angles are congruent. So the opposite angles are the ones that are diagonally like across from each other. So this one and this one. And then these two are congruent. The ones that are next to each other, we call that consecutive. Those are supplementary. Right? So these two guys add up to 180. These two guys add up to 180. So one thing that reminds us of angles in a quad or quadrilateral, sum to 360 degrees. So you'll use that for practice, the practice worksheet you do. So just remember that the 4 angles together would be 360, because if these guys are supplementary, these guys are supplementary, then they have to add to 360. The diagonals, again, if you didn't get those, it's fine because it's hard to see from that image, but the diagonals bisect each other. So if I draw in my diagonals, this picture is probably too small, but it's fine. These diagonals, they bisect each other, so that means these would be congruent and these would be congruent. Okay, so I would probably have this picture somewhere in your notes, maybe a little bigger than mine so that you remember all the different pieces. And then the last one, we don't use quite as much, but the diagonals form congruent triangles because of side angle side. So I drew a little picture here to show that. So I just drew in one diagonal. We know opposite sides are congruent, so I labeled those, and then I just needed one pair of opposite angles congruent, and those two triangles would then be congruent by side angle side. Okay, so what you're going to do on the practice worksheet is we're going to give you some parallelograms, and you have to state whether, some quadrilaterals, and you have to state whether it's a parallelogram. So there's some methods we use to do that, and I'll go through a couple examples here. I'm going to type these out, so if you want to type with me, it's a little easier. So if you're trying to prove that a quadrilateral is a parallelogram, you need to know at least one of these 5 statements. So the first one is to prove both pairs of sides parallel. So if you can show that both pairs of opposite sides are parallel, then you can say it's a parallelogram. Prove both pairs of sides congruent. Prove one pair of opposite sides congruent and parallel. So if you're only using one pair of opposite sides, both things have to be true. It has to be congruent and parallel. Then you can say, okay, this guy is a parallelogram. Or you could prove the diagonals bisect each other. And lastly, you could prove both pairs of opposite angles congruent. So when we say prove here, I don't mean like write a T-chart proof pretty much. I'm just saying like if we give you a picture like we'll do in a second, can you state it's a parallelogram using one of these as your reasoning? So in order to do that, one thing I want to add, you only need to show, oops, sorry, one, it's an O, of these. So you don't need to prove all 5 things are true about the shape. You only need to pick one that you can prove based on the information given. If one of them is true, then it's a parallelogram. If you don't have information for those, you could also just look for the congruent triangles like we talked about in the last one. If you can show there's 2 congruent triangles like this, then you can say it's a parallelogram. But more often than not, we use one of these 5. So I drew in a couple examples, so you might want to draw in these pictures exactly as I have them here with the labeling and everything, just to show you what you'll do on the worksheet. So you're going to be given a picture, a quadrilateral, and you're trying to say whether or not it's a parallelogram. So when I look at this first one, the tick marks are showing me these opposite sides are congruent and opposite sides are parallel. This is only one pair though. I don't know anything about the other 2 sides. Okay. So even though it looks like a parallelogram, I can't just say that. I have to use one of these reasonings. And when I match it up, it definitely matches number 3. So I'm going to say yes, it's a parallelogram. Parallelogram. And then you need to state why and how you know. And I know that this is a parallelogram because we have one pair opposite sides congruent and parallel. And it's fine to use abbreviation like this if you don't want to write out the whole statement. That's totally fine. So this is why this first shape is a parallelogram. The second one here, again, you can't just go based on looks. The drawing looks like a parallelogram, but that's not enough. So the information I see, I have one pair of parallel sides, and I have one pair of consecutive angles that are congruent. So I don't know if that really tells us because I don't have anything here about consecutive angles. And I would need both sides to be parallel because these guys, they can be the same if these both measure 90. It could potentially be one, but I still don't have enough information because I only have the one side being parallel, and these are consecutive angles, not opposite angles. And even still, I would need more, I would need both pairs. So I'm going to say not a parallelogram. I need more info. Okay, so again, you can't just go based on looks. You're using the reasoning and the information given to decide.